Hey everybody, welcome to our webinar today. We're so thrilled that you are able to join us. We'll get started in just a couple seconds as folks trickle in from the Zoom waiting room. It looks like the number is still ticking up a little bit, which is great to have so many people here taking the time out of your day today to be a part of this webinar. So I'm Dr. Rachel Merson, and I'm a clinical psychologist and one of the SMA board members. I am thrilled to be able to introduce Dr. Alicia Goodman to you all, who will be presenting the talk utilizing space treatment to enhance therapeutic outcomes for selective mutism. Before I turn things over to you, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Goodman. So she is a licensed psychologist and nationally certified school psychologist and is the owner and clinical director at Simply Psychology in Phoenix, Arizona, a small group practice specializing in working with anxiety disorders in children, teens, and their parents. She's also a staff psychologist at Phoenix Children's Hospital. She's trained in space for ARFID, and space for failure to launch. She has extensive training and professional experience in the field of selective mutism using PCIT-SM, CBT, shaping, video modeling, and exposures to help individuals with SM of all ages. Dr. Goodman has developed intensive summer camps and social skills groups for kids with selective mutism. She's developed and presented several parent and teacher trainings on the topic of SM and has provided district-wide trainings on SM for school-based professionals and administrators. She also has created an 8-week on-demand space training workshop for parents, a basic training for parents on differentiating shyness from SM, and she's been an invited local and national speaker on the topics of selective mutism and anxiety disorders in children. She remains an active participant and professional within the Arizona and American Psychological Societies, the National Association of School Psychologists, the International Obsessive Compulsive Disorder Foundation, the Tourette's Association of America, and the Selective Mutism Association. So as you can see, Dr. Goodman brings a wealth of expertise to us today, and I know we will all learn a tremendous amount from hearing her speak. I did want to quickly share with you all that this presentation today will be geared a little bit more towards our treating professionals in the audience. Though if you are a parent or a caregiver, you are more than welcome to stay on and attend and learn with us. However, on April 10th, there will be another SMA-sponsored webinar on using the space treatment, but this one will be geared more towards parents. So feel free to join that presentation as well. And just a few other housekeeping notes. Our webinar today is brought to you with support from the Gordon and Marilyn Macklin Foundation. So we always thank them for their generosity and all the resources that they give to the Selective Mutism Association. And lastly, Dr. Goodman will be answering questions probably at the end of her talk. We do ask that you use the Q&A feature of Zoom and not the chat feature, and we'll try to get through as many questions as possible. So with that, I will turn things over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Merson. Appreciate it.
You are welcome.
Yeah, so happy to be here and have this opportunity to speak to all of you about some things that I'm very passionate about in my work, and specifically working with parents, which, as you know, as we work with kids with SM, a lot of the work is with parents. So this is a great combination of being able to use that space treatment, which is focused on parent behavior, and helping our kids with SM. This is my acknowledgement slide. This webinar was made possible thanks to a generous donation by the grant, from the Gordon and Marilyn Macklin Foundation. I want to give acknowledgement to Dr. Ellie Leibowitz from the Yale Child Study Center, who has created the space treatment program. The website spacetreatment.net has a lot of great resources, research articles, information about signing up for training. And in recognition of cultural awareness, I identify as a Jewish, white, cisgender, English-speaking, straight female. So that is where my lens comes from. And also thank you, of course, to the Selective Mutism Association for having me. So you learned a little bit about me, and we have a poll that I would like, if we could launch that poll, Kristen, that would be fabulous, just to understand your familiarity with space treatment before I get started, because I like to know who my audience is. Okay, wow. All right. So we have that is super cool. We have 30, about 33, 33, and 33%. So some very familiar, 30% know a little bit, and 30% not familiar. So this is actually perfect. I think we have a good combination here in this presentation today, for those of you who are not as familiar, as well as those of you who are. So I think that's perfect. Thank you. The objectives today, I'm going to describe and guide understanding of some key and core components of space treatment, providing some insight into how to take that space treatment guidance, and how can we use that in our work with our SM families, and to explore some strategies for enhancing therapeutic outcomes for our families with SM, using modules and information from space treatment, as well as in conjunction with the other work that we do with our SM kiddos, with our PCIT-SM and exposure work and CBT work. So, what is SPACE? SPACE stands for Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. It focuses exclusively on parent behavior, which is the only thing that parents can control, rather than directly modifying child behavior. It's really great for kids who may be resistant to treatment, so maybe some of our older kiddos, as well as helping anybody who maybe has not had success with previous treatment strategies, really just focusing on that parent behavior. Parents are guided through space to increase supportive responses to their child, giving empathy statements and supportive statements, by both accepting where their child is, understanding that their child is feeling anxiety, and also giving confidence to their child's ability for handling difficult things. And then there's a lot of monitoring and tracking as it relates to accommodation, which I'll define accommodation in a moment. But we really look at how is the parental behavior impacting the interaction, or the keeping the anxiety cycle going. And we look at how have reducing accommodations over the course of treatment really impacted and helped their child become more confident. This is a resource that I would be remiss to not mention. This is a book by Dr. Ellie Leibowitz, Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD. I recommend it to all of my parents, any clinicians that I've trained, any that I work with. This is an excellent book, and it parallels the space treatment program. We know that research has shown space to be effective for several different types of anxiety. And there was a research study that was done in 2020. They did a case illustration, actually, of someone named Alec in their research. And they really looked at space for social anxiety. And Alec was a 10-year-old boy who really struggled with receiving some help and assistance with his social anxiety through CBT alone. He had had 2 years of CBT without much progress. And it was identified through treatment that parents were doing a lot of accommodating. And the accommodations were really big and prevalent throughout his day. And the parents were noticing that his anxiety was actually getting worse, not better, which we know that that's the case when we do accommodating, but parents sometimes don't know that. They're just trying to protect and trying to help, and they're doing everything they can to try to help their child, but in this case, it was making it worse. Um, Additionally, after 2 years of CBT, Alec wasn't super thrilled about the idea of going to more treatment or more therapy, and so the space treatment was incorporated into his treatment, and he did much better with parents changing their accommodations, reducing accommodations, and changing their parental behaviors towards him. So we do have that based on social anxiety. If you read this article, which is available on the spacetreatment.net website as a research article under resources and research, you will see as you read through that Alex sounds like he has social anxiety, but he also sounds like he has some selective mutism. He has trouble speaking up, ordering his food. He was only talking to some select peers at school, and it was really impacting his daily functioning. So this right now is the closest thing we have to looking at space with SM in a research paper, but it's looking good. So I would like to show how we have 8 key concepts of space treatment that I've chosen from the space treatment program and how we can use that to enhance treatment of SM. And I learned, for myself when I got trained in space treatment, which was after my training through SMTI for selective mutism, that I started incorporating both into everyday work with my parents. In fact, for this presentation, I had to figure out how do I separate out what is specifically space and what is what I just tend to do. So I have separated it out for you. The first thing that we're doing, and I think you're doing a lot of this anyway as you're working with parents, hopefully working with parents with kids with SM, is psychoeducation. We're teaching them, right? And one of the main things we want to teach them is this understanding the difference between an avoidance cycle, which maintains anxiety, and a brave cycle. So looking here, in the context of SM, our child has an opportunity to speak. They might feel distressed. They're going to feel distressed. And then they avoid the speaking, right? And this is sometimes parents are rescuing, what we call rescuing, speaking for their child, or accommodating in some way, which allows them to escape or avoid the situation where there's that speaking opportunity or expectation. In the moment, everyone feels better for a short period of time. And then that, though, unfortunately reinforces the avoidance because, wow, I avoided it. It feels better. That's going to lead to more avoiding. And that continues the SM and anxiety cycle. So, looking at the brave cycle, and this is the one that's going to break the pattern for us, we still want to have that opportunity to speak. The child's going to feel distressed, and that's where we may need to bring in some coping skills, right? Some things like progressive muscle relaxation, some deep breathing, knowing ahead of time they're going to be in a situation where there's an expectation to speak, using some of those coping skills to then practice being brave using their brave voice, which is still going to feel uncomfortable. We're not going to necessarily make it comfortable right away. We want to, become comfortable with the uncomfortable, but it's going to feel uncomfortable. However, by being brave or taking steps towards being brave and using our voice or communicating in some way, it's going to then reinforce that brave behavior. So then it gets easier to be brave the next time. This is really important to educate parents and teachers and educators about the fact that we want to continue to have an opportunity for our children with SM to communicate in some way, right? Because sometimes teachers can accommodate by not calling on a child, and we really just want to make sure that they have some way to communicate, and we don't want to have them avoid asking the child to participate. There may be nonverbal ways that they can participate, but we don't want to leave them out of giving them that opportunity to speak. The second one here is really understanding what is accommodation, and we're tracking accommodation as well. So accommodation is a behavior or avoidance of behavior engaged in by an adult usually can be siblings too, for the purpose of reducing anxiety in their child. So there is a scale called the family accommodation scale for anxiety. There's also one specific for OCD. And there is one that a child can fill out as well, kind of reporting on their parents' accommodation of their behavior. Some things that are included on that have to do with how often are you changing your schedule to accommodate your child's anxiety? How often are you changing what you would normally do for your child? How often are you reassuring them? Those kinds of questions. And if you're doing your intake interview with your parents, some questions that are along the lines of trying to figure out if they're accommodating has to do with parental behavior. So what are you doing when your child feels anxious? When somebody asks them a question and they're not going to respond, or that has been your experience in the past, what do you do? How are you reacting and responding in that situation? And I do find that it's very helpful to give parents the language that they can use when they're in that situation, because usually their anxiety is high as well. So you want to give them some language like we're working on our brave voice, or or just practice being uncomfortable in this situation, and then giving them something else to do, though, because that waiting time is tough. And anytime we tell anyone or guide anyone to stop a behavior, even parents, we want to give them something else that they can do in that moment. So maybe it's repeating the question if they're in that level 2 mediation range for communication where they're using a mediator. Maybe they're repeating the question that the child's being asked, or maybe they're, again, just saying, we're working on our brave voice, but we want to give them something to do. And we have them track their accommodations. So we have them look at their day from morning, afternoon, nighttime, after school, bedtime. What are the parents doing that is purposely reducing their child's anxiety? Behaviors are either doing or not doing. Some examples of that as it relates specific to SM or social anxiety are things like speaking for the child with SM, right? Ordering food for a child at a restaurant, maybe not inviting others to come over to the house, or not going places due to not wanting the child to be anxious. A teacher not calling on a child with SM can be accommodating. Oftentimes I hear from parents, well, I allow them to avoid something. I allow them to not do something. And that's not really an accommodation. You can think of it as, what is the behavior you're engaging in? Well, I'm allowing them to avoid going to school. Okay, well, what you're really doing is you're not getting in the car and you're not telling them it's time to go to school, right? You're just not doing those things. And so it's really about, what is the parent doing or not doing for the purpose of reducing anxiety. And it is also important, as they're tracking their accommodation, to think about, are there other people that are accommodating their child's non-speaking or their child's social anxiety? And a lot of times, grandparents, extended families, teachers, those are people that might be inadvertently reinforcing that avoidance cycle and accommodating. So sometimes we get into that as well, especially when there is SM present in the schools, which is typical. It's also important to think about accommodation versus parent choice. And so parents often have anxiety about their child's anxiety, very common, right? So if they're doing something for the purpose of reducing their own anxiety, that is what we call parent choice. And it's okay as long as they know that that is a choice they're making. And it's also not a great target for reducing accommodation. Now, they can work on it, but it's not typically, a target, because we're really only targeting things that the parent is doing to reduce their child's anxiety. So some examples of that for parent choice. Maybe they know their child will answer a question, but it takes 30 seconds for them to do it. But parents feel really anxious when they're waiting, so they don't like waiting, or they don't like feeling judged personally as the parent, and so they'll answer for them. That would be a parent choice in that situation. Or some that extend beyond SM or social anxiety, but some that come up often to kind of illustrate the parent choice: making lunch for your child because they're afraid their child will go hungry, even though the child is capable of making their own lunch. So just knowing when it is a parent choice, so that accommodation can be the target. When parents sometimes aren't sure if it's an accommodation, this happens often. A lot of the work that I do with parents is about identifying, is this an accommodation or not? Are some really key questions that they can ask, right? Do you, or did you do this with all of your children? So we're identifying, your child has social anxiety, your child has SM. Are you doing that? Are you talking for all of your children? Are you choosing to, do X, Y, and Z with all of them, or just this child? Would you like to be able to stop this behavior? And this really hits on a key concept of space treatment as well, which has to do with the interference of daily life, of the parent's daily life, in accommodating for their child. A lot of parents are exhausted from doing so many accommodations that it's really impacting their own boundaries, their personal boundaries, their emotional boundaries. And so oftentimes parents are motivated to stop accommodating. They're just not quite sure how. And so we can help lead them through that. Asking them, if your child were not anxious, would you still do this? That's a really good key to know. And also, what would happen if you did not do this one day? And what we're looking for there is for a parent to say, "Oh my goodness, my kiddo would not be okay," right? They have that kind of mentality that they're not going to be okay if they experience anxiety. or they'll cry, or they'll be really upset, or they'll be dysregulated, and that also is a clue that, okay, you're doing this because it's reducing your child's anxiety. So the third key concept to consider with space treatment and as it relates to SM is this protecting or accommodating behavior versus demanding behavior. And so we have these statements or beliefs sometimes that lead us to protecting behaviors or accommodation. And those are things like they can't do it, it's too hard for them, they won't be okay. Um, and then we have statements and beliefs that lead to demanding behaviors, which are things like, why can't they just do it? Just do it already. It's not that bad. And if you've talked to a lot of parents about how they respond to their child's anxiety, usually they'll fall more heavily into either protecting or demanding. And oftentimes, if you are working with a couple, one person in that couple tends to be more protecting, and the other tends to be more demanding. And so there's some work that you can do with families. I know I have it on a later slide, but I'm on it right now, is in regards to role play. So have the parent that tends to be more demanding, have them act like they're more protecting, like the other parent, or vice versa. And that can really help put the other person in their shoes and understand the perspective of the other person, and can kind of help them get to a place where they can find a common ground. And so if protecting is not really the thing that we want to be doing all the time, and demanding is not what we want to be doing all the time, what do we do? So the main tenet really of space treatment is using these supportive statements. So supportive statements are the best way to handle anxiety versus protective or demanding statements. And these are things that include empathy, I understand, I accept how you're feeling, as well as support and confidence. And it's really important. So Ellie Leibowitz, he talks a lot about the mac and the cheese. And so I put that in quotes. It definitely I'm quoting him. But that has to do with you can't have one with the other without the other. So you can't have, the empathy statement without the confidence part, the confidence without the empathy. You definitely need both. And it's important to recognize that when we're giving the empathy, right, it's about the feeling. When we're giving the confidence part, it's about working through the distress. It's about distress tolerance, not I know you feel anxious and I know you can talk to Susie, right? It's I know you feel anxious and I know you can work through those anxious feelings. So that's what's important as we relate to the confidence, because in treating anxiety, right, we're working on that distress tolerance piece. Okay. I mentioned this a little before, but just having parents on the same page, if there are two parents in the home that you're working with, finding some common ground, using some role play, can really help kind of get parents on that same page. Another important key part of space treatment is what we call as unilateral decision making. So oftentimes when we have an anxious kiddo, we're asking them all the time, like, is this okay? Are you okay if I do it this way? We're asking for permission because, gosh, if they give us permission to do this thing, then they're not going to feel anxious, right? And I will say it is also important to tell parents and to understand that parents are wired to protect their child. So all of this is natural and normal that they want to be protecting and they want to be accommodating. And I think that's an important piece when you're working with parents to share that with them, that you understand that they have not done anything wrong, that it's natural and normal. But because their child has anxiety, they need to kind of think about that in a different way. Um, we are usually wondering, is this okay? We're concerned. Maybe we're concerned about behaviors that we might get from our kids, right? So we want to make sure we're trying to get them involved. But when a child is really anxious, their thinking part of their brain isn't working so great. And so to ask them, especially in the moment when they're feeling anxious, is this okay? Would this be okay with you if we did it this way? The logic side isn't working very well. And trying to get buy-in at that stage is just not going to be helpful. We do want them on board to buy in if possible. We want to have maybe a conversation when they're not anxious, but we can also include them in smaller choices or offerings. So we make the decision as the parent, right? So as the therapist, you're telling them you're going to make the decision as the parents of what you're doing with your behavior. That is something that is in your control. However, you can still give your child choices. So, for example, we have decided we're no longer going to talk for you when we go to Applebee's to order whatever you're ordering. Would you like me to hold your hand through that, or just, be next to you or stand next to you. So giving them some autonomy, some feeling like they have some choice or decision in the matter. But as it relates to your behavior as in reducing the accommodation, the parent's behavior, that's something that the parents decide. And then within the space treatment program, parents write a letter or are offered to write a letter to their child to inform them of a change. And so parents are making changes to their behavior, they're letting their child know. And writing a letter has a few functions. I've used this independently with other families as well, um, because it really allows them to solidify for themselves what is the behavior that they're changing. I'm no longer going to speak for Susie, in this situation, or we are going to, start the car and drive to school every morning. But they're writing it down. It's helping the parents commit to it. It's also usually more seriously taken by the child or the teen because maybe parents have tried to have these conversations before. They've maybe tried to put their foot down or to say, we're going to do this or we're going to do that. Also, it's focused on parental behavior, which is usually different than what's happened before, with parents maybe saying, you are going to go to school. That's very different, right, than saying, I'm going to be ready at 7 o'clock in the morning. I'm going to start the car and drive to school, right? Parent behavior. So it forces all the details to be sorted out. The plan is more seriously taken. And usually it uses a sandwich technique of pairing love and support, those supportive statements, with the behavior that the parents will change. So that hard thing to hear. And sometimes kids need reassurance that they're not in trouble. It's nothing that they've done wrong. But this is just something the parent is doing to try to help their child work through their anxiety. But sometimes they do need to know that it's not a punishment, even though it might feel that way. Once a plan is in place, as it relates to the social anxiety or SM, of reducing the accommodation, there should not be back and forth debate with their child. And so you want to teach them and show them how to disengage with their child in a healthy way to not continue that conversation. So there may be something like, we're going to, have you, we're going to, sorry, not have you, we're going to, when we go to Applebee's for lunch, we're not going to speak for you anymore. And the child may say, well, I think I'll be ready next month to do that. I'm not ready right now. And then the parent might say, well, we've decided, they can reaffirm what they've said, but continuing a conversation back and forth tells the child that you're still considering a different option than what you've already presented. So with this ping pong match example, I share this, Dr. Ellie Leibowitz shares this, and it just sticks in my head to share this with parents. If you're playing ping pong, they hit a ball over to you, that's them saying something to you. You hit the ball back, that's you saying something back to them. They're going to continue to play and you're playing the game, right? Anytime you mention anything back to them, even if it's reassurance, and continuing to reassure, right? You're giving that ping pong match, you're keeping it going. Well, what happens if you put your paddle down and you walk away from the table? They might hit the ball, they might hit it again and again because they're used to getting it back, but eventually they'll stop because it's no fun to play just by themselves. And so teaching parents that the importance of disengagement when it is a good time to disengage. Oftentimes our parents will get in the cycle of this reassurance cycle. It'll be okay. I know that you can do it. It'll be okay. It'll be okay. And just continuing to reassure over and over and over again. It happens a lot at night because a lot of worries happen at nighttime too. So just making parents aware that sometimes that is accommodating behavior as well, that reassurance piece. Okay. The seventh concept here that I want to talk about a little bit is reinforcement of desired behavior. Now, if you're working with parents with kids with SM and or anxiety in general, we may already be doing some reward charts, right? Or brave books or things that they're doing to earn, stickers or small rewards working towards things for brave behavior. So they're already kind of doing that. But it's also important to consider giving reinforcement for a child who's coping with the changes that the parent has made, right? And this really is not contingent on the child's acceptance of what their parent has decided to do, or willingness, or not crying, or handling it well. It's just the fact that they've lived through it, right? They have coped with the parental change and they have lived through it. And there's all different kinds of reinforcement, from, something that's tangible, something that they can work towards, to simple praise. Just, I'm so proud of you, handling the changes that happened this week. I know that that's tough. That's been tough for you, and I'm really proud of you. So simple praise can be good too. And thinking about, labeled praise, right, from PCIT-SM, using that as well. Okay. So the last one here is really about recruiting supporters. And there's lots of different ways that we can recruit supporters and working with our families who are dealing with SM. In considering who might be helpful to support our parents, because parents are changing their behavior, they're handling also what's going to happen with their child, how is their child going to react and respond to these changes, right? So they may choose to reach out to a neighbor or a close friend, or some extended family, and explain, these are the changes that I'm making to my behavior. I expect, Sally, Susie, Joey is going to, have a really big reaction to that. And we can include supporters in several different ways. Supporters can be people that talk with your child, maybe somebody that's close to your child, to reinforce and support what parents are doing. It can be a support that is there for the parent to be able to reach out, like a tag team, or reach out when they're struggling with something. And this also could be a teacher, extended family, and store clerks is on there. I'm going to explain each of these. So a supporter for reducing accommodation as it relates to our SM kids, for including teachers, once we've identified that maybe there's an accommodation happening, right, in the classroom, this teacher can help be on board and be on the same page as it relates to how can they support what's happening to help work on those SM goals. What can the teacher do to help support the child or the parent, and how does everybody kind of get on the same page with that? Also, store clerks might seem silly because we don't know store clerks. They're not close to us. How do we recruit them as supporters? This can be something as simple as giving a store clerk an index card that says, we're working on being brave. Please, please ask my child, this question: do you like hot dogs or hamburgers? Something they've practiced at home, right? We use that with exposures and with our SM clients and families, through the modeling of exposures and doing brave exercises. But we don't always consider them as like extended support, but truly they are supporters of what is happening, what's going on. It's also often used if if there's concern for a child being hostile or aggressive. And in that way, we might include supporters to be in the home, knowing that, my child's not going to respond very well to the news, that I'm not going to talk for them anymore when we're at, school, or we're at this other place. And I'm expecting, them to get really violent. I'm expecting them to get aggressive. And in that case, having an extra person in the home when they're being told that this change is going to happen can help dampen the expression of aggression, or their feelings of upset in the moment. And so it can really be used for that as well. We're also looking at how, when teachers are reducing their accommodation in the classroom, what does it look like? Because we do want them to ask the question, but maybe Johnny's not ready to answer out loud. So we have to come up with some type of way that Johnny can respond, whether it's giving them the question ahead of time so that Johnny's prepared, whether it's being able for Johnny to show some kind of visual response or to point to something. But that also can help as it relates to basically, the village, right? The supportive network around our children. So kind of to recap here, in regards to enhancing therapeutic outcomes, and I think when we work with our kids with SM, right, we know how important parent work is. PCIT-SM, parent-child interaction therapy. So we're focused on the parents and how they are already interacting with their children. And so I think it comes naturally for those of us that do this work to include the parents. These are just some real key ways as it relates to including those space treatment concepts in working with our parents. So having some separate parent sessions to educate parents about, having that psychoeducation relating to the anxiety cycle versus the brave cycle, relating to accommodations, assessing for accommodation, having them chart through their day. When are they accommodating? How are they accommodating? And how is that accommodation, leading to maybe continuing that anxiety cycle? So oftentimes I will have parent sessions. Either they will do a training ahead of time about SM and accommodating. They might do the space treatment program to understand that first, or maybe I'm just doing a few sessions with them before even working with their child. My intakes are always parent only first. And giving them some of that education so that they understand what to expect. So we have a lot, right? When we're working with our SM families, we're teaching them the PCIT-SM, we're teaching them the CDI and the VDI, and then also teaching them, I think is important, about accommodation and reducing accommodation. So we can also have separate sessions with parents throughout treatment to ensure parents are on the same page. And there'll be some clues throughout, right? If it is a two-parent household, well, dad is really kind of forcing this, and I'm kind of saying he doesn't have to go. And so we're looking for those kinds of clues or words that they're using to express what's happening at home. And maybe we need to have a separate session to really talk about, okay, what does this look like? How do we get you guys on the same page? Because we need to have a unilateral, front moving forward. That's a decision you're making about how you're changing your behavior. And both of you, have to agree and engage in the same way in order to help your child. And that can extend to grandparents, especially if they're living in the home, or nannies, caretakers, things like that. I have had other adults that are involved with the child on a daily basis come to session, or teachers receive specific training just to help everybody be on the same page. So there is some additional work that can happen as it relates to that. Having parents set goals related to reducing their accommodation. Obviously, that's part of the space treatment, but in a way that it can parallel our SM work, and charting behaviors. So what that means is initially when they're identifying what the accommodation is, they're writing everything down that they think might be, right? And then you may have a session with them to say, okay, this really is an accommodation. This is a parent choice. Let's focus on, something that's an accommodation, and usually also focusing on something that really impacts their daily life as the parent, because they're going to be most motivated to change that. And then focusing in on one of those behaviors and then having them track and chart, when are they still doing that, or have they reduced that? And then we're also looking at, right, what's the impact on the child? Well, I stopped talking for Johnny at the supermarket, and he was able to, hand the cashier the credit card or whatever. So just looking at how is it impacting the child behavior. And as they're making that plan to consider what accommodation to drop, it's important to also think about what could happen. So making a plan for, well, what if, Johnny runs out of the store, or what if Johnny melts down and, cries in the middle of the store when I don't talk for them anymore. And so, okay, let's talk through that. Let's problem solve and figure out what is your behavior going to look like. And a lot of times that will reduce the parents' anxiety about reducing accommodation, because a lot of the worries they have are, well, when I don't do this, my child's going to melt down. How do I handle that? And so talking through it can really be very helpful. Okay. So what's next? We definitely would love some research as it relates to space treatment and specific to our SM population. I have done some collecting of family accommodation scale for before my space treatment workshop, my 8-week workshop, and after. However, I would love to identify families specifically with children that have a diagnosis of SM. In the past, it's been just really anybody that feels like they could benefit from space treatment coming through and doing accommodation skills before and after. I can usually tell when they submit their initial family accommodation skills if space treatment is going to be effective or good for them. And so those are the ones that we have conversations about continuing that. But I think if anyone else is out there that would love to do this, I think it would be fabulous to have some research specific to our SM population. And we have quite a bit of time for questions. I guess I kind of sped through that. So I'm open to answering any questions that might be out there.
Well, I have a couple questions that people asked as you were presenting. Dr. Goodman, and I can start by going through those, and other people, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A as well. I think I'll just kind of go in the order in which they came in. So earlier on in your talk, you had used the phrase level 2 mediation, and someone was unfamiliar with that term and asked if you could just kind of please describe what that meant and where that term came from.
Yeah. So I should have used the word intermediary. Maybe that's more familiar to people. When we look at the communication bridge by Dr. Shipon Blum that she has through the Smart Center for as it relates to treating SM, we have different levels of speaking, right? So we have 0, 1, 2, and 3. So 0 is when our kids are frozen, they're not talking at all. They're not able to make eye contact. They're usually hiding behind a parent. 1 is what we call kind of this nonverbal or handover takeover. So they're willing to like take something from somebody or hand something to somebody else. And then level 2 is where they may be using an intermediary, and that's what I was referring to. So that might be that they're responding to a parent in front of an unfamiliar speaker. So maybe the unfamiliar speaker, you as a clinician, is asking like, do you want the blue marker or the red marker? They're not answering you, but parent can say to the child, do you want the red marker or the blue marker? The child then answers the parent. That's level 2 for on the communication bridge. There's also devices and things like that that they can use in that intermediary stage. And then level 3 would be being fully verbal. So that's what I was referring to. Does that answer the person's question? Okay.
I think so. Another question, and this is actually a sort of a comment, but I'll add a question onto it. So when you were talking about, I think, parents communicating to their children that have made a decision to remove accommodations, like the parent saying, I am going to be in the car at 7 o'clock and I am going to drive to school. The comment came through that says, well, a child can still refuse to go to school even when the parent declares they're leaving at 7. So I think, can you maybe talk a little bit more about how you would coach parents in responding to child's behavior that may not change even as the parental behavior is changing?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I love that. So we would definitely problem solve and talk through the entire plan, kind of as I spoke about towards the end there, to say, well, I don't think if the parent's saying, I don't think my child's going to get in the car to go to school, you may have some type of scaffolding where you have a conversation with them where we're just going to get in the car and drive to school. There's no other expectation, right? We're just driving to school and then we'll come back. So that's really where you're doing some exposure to help them. Obviously, it's going to depend on why they're not getting in the car. If it's because they don't want to go to school, they're scared of going to school, then sometimes just saying to them, we're going to get, we're leaving, and but we can just drive there and come back just as levels on the fear hierarchy, or what they can do to tolerate. And then, the next step might be they get to school and they open the door, but they don't have to get out. And then maybe they open the door and they stand. I actually had a family that I worked through this with, and they stand outside the door and then they're going to walk up to the front door. So just kind of doing that. However, I realize the question is, they don't have to get in the car. True. So if we're looking at, be a behavior or something more that's a behavior, and we can't figure out what are they most comfortable with, even to the point of like, all I need you to do is you're gonna kind of sit in the car, like maybe that's the plan. So I'm kind of meshing here, right? This space, which is just parent. And then also if we need to add something in, like doing an exposure or getting from them where their level of fear is. So maybe they're just sitting in the car in their own driveway. And that is where it's really important to be working with us as a clinician, right? To identify what is the child capable of so that we can help inform the parent as it relates to the accommodation. Um, but yes, you're right. You're not going to force the child to get in the car. So you want to try to have something where they are capable of doing what is it that they're comfortable enough to do. And then eventually, right, and I think you bring up a good point. This person asked the question is it doesn't have to be full on accommodation, like goes all the way away, right? We can take steps towards it going away. And so if the first step is, we're ready at 7 o'clock and we're sitting in the driveway, that's the first step. Um, I would probably also consider talking to them about, is there something that they might look forward to in the car? Or maybe we're doing breakfast in the car, or maybe there's some other motivation that we can get. But that sounds a little bit like if we're still struggling and we're not getting anywhere related to like we're just sitting in the driveway, and then it's not an avoidance of going to school that we're dealing with. It sounds like more of a behavior that we're dealing with, which could be handled a little differently since space is really focusing on anxiety. I hope that was helpful.
So there are a couple questions that came through that I think I am going to try to synthesize and combine because they really share similar themes of how do you kind of integrate space treatment, which I think as it was originally developed really is a parent only treatment with direct work with a child. So some questions are you kind of how often do you involve children in sessions and do live coaching or in vivo exposures with kids. Other questions were about before you have parents remove accommodations, do you do a certain amount of kind of child work to get them to a place where they might be more ready for that? So I'll let you sort of speak to that kind of mixing and matching of treatments or how you might sequence different interventions.
Yeah, yeah, that's really good. So, um, I think the easiest way to answer that is probably just to take you through my process and like where it changes and what I do based on kind of what's happening with the family. So in the beginning, I'll do a FASA, right? So I'm just looking at family accommodation. I want to check it out across all areas. I'm also obviously assessing for different kinds of anxiety. So we're handling SM, but are there other anxieties that we're working with? I will start my education with families really off the bat, helping them understand the psychoeducation of what maintains anxiety versus the brave cycle so that they can start to understand how their own behavior might be impacting their child. And then with a true SM kid, I'm going right into PCIT-SM. So that's my focus with them. If they're really struggling with that piece, or there's a lot of accommodation that is happening kind of outside of the SM work, then I might suggest to the parents that we go through kind of a separate space treatment protocol with them, which isn't always integrated necessarily into the work that we're doing with the PCIT. Because PCIT, obviously the kid is there and involved, and space is just focused on parent behavior. So it really depends on um, if they're not responding to the PCIT-SM, but I'm incorporating the different pieces of a space with the parents being on the same page, doing the FASA in the very beginning, understanding accommodation, and seeing if there are other ways or areas, who's accommodating how, and then we'll make goals around that. Um, I guess I probably integrate it more in when I'm having those parent sessions because I do separate parent sessions as well. And that's when I'm really addressing the space stuff as it relates to parental behavior. Whereas when I'm working with the kids, we're doing, PCIT. And then once they're comfortable speaking with me, the kids are helping come up with some of the goals that they're going to be working on for their speaking behavior. So they are involved in that piece because that's related to their behavior, right? So when I'm working with them through that therapy for SM, I'm working with the kiddo to help them set goals and help them tell me, like, how nervous would you feel to be, I know you're nervous to go to school. What if you were just sitting in the car in the driveway? Oh, that would be a 0, right? On a SUD scale, 0. Okay, cool. Let's try that. I'll start something that's super easy for you. Okay, parent, this is what you're gonna do. You're gonna be ready at 7 o'clock, and kiddo has, and we're probably using a reinforcement chart or something like that. We're like, okay, especially once it gets more tricky, we're gonna drive to the school. You don't have to get out, but every time you do it, check mark. We're gonna do that 5 times this week. Okay, great. So it's integrating all the pieces, but you're right in that, yeah, space is just focused on the parent behavior. So that is something that is specifically separate, if that's.
And another question about for whom space might be appropriate. So I think that, as you've talked about this, it's really kind of focused on anxiety-driven behaviors. But the question is space appropriate for a child who is refusing to do behaviors, things like changing clothes, taking a shower, if parents aren't doing it for them, or if the parents aren't involved in the child's behavior? So a case where it seems like maybe there's a high level of parental involvement, but may or may not be anxiety there.
Yes. So I'm speaking a little out of turn here because I didn't create space. But I have found it personally successful with I'm working with a kiddo right now who has some of those behaviors. And the parent gets frustrated that the child will not dress themselves. And so they had been just dressing them, accommodating that, right? And so we just did a very simple thing where we said, okay, well, what's the worst thing is to say, go to school in your pajamas, or I guess you don't have pants on, I guess I'll take you in your underwear. And that enough was enough motivating for the child to go ahead and just get dressed themselves. So it is, though that parent was accommodating, the child does have high anxiety, but we're seeing a lot of behaviors also that aren't necessarily about anxiety, and it is helping to reduce those accommodations just by saying, I'm no longer going to be dressing you, having that child be self-motivated. So I hope that answers the question.
Mhm. And while we're kind of talking about accommodations, can you explain a little bit more about the difference between parental choice and parental accommodation? I think there was kind of some confusion around that.
Sure. So I think that the easiest distinguishing factor for me when I think about that is parental choice is usually about reducing parent anxiety, and accommodation is usually done to reduce the child's anxiety. So I know that they can be interlaced because a lot of times our parents are anxious when their kids are anxious. Well, I understand that. Um, but when I have a lot of times it will come up like, well, my kids in high school, I'm making their lunch for them every day. Why are you doing that? Because I'm nervous as a parent saying, I'm nervous they won't eat. I'm nervous that they won't make their lunch and they won't eat. Okay. So that's a parent choice, right? You're deciding, that's your choice to make their lunch, but it's not like when you ask them, well, what would happen if you didn't? Well, nothing. My kid would just go to school without lunch. Okay. They wouldn't be upset about it. They wouldn't feel anxious about it. No, they wouldn't care. Okay, that's a parent choice, right? If you stop doing that, your child's not going to have an anxious response to that. So asking that question of like, if the parent stops doing it, is the child going to feel anxious? In that case, then that is an accommodation. So that would be a good target. But otherwise, there are a lot of choices that parents make to alleviate their own anxiety. And that would not, because even though space is focused on parental behavior, the target is the child's anxiety.
Excellent. Right, we have about 5 more minutes. There are a few questions here about kind of the social environment and the role of the supporters. Maybe I'll kind of read you some pieces of these questions. Are you recommending that you use the social environment when a child is more inhibited to support the child's acceptance? And I think by that they may mean acceptance of the reduced accommodation that the parent is providing. And then another question about how the supporter's presence may change the child's response, and that maybe if there is a supporter there, the child may have a smaller reaction. It will dampen the child's response, but then when that supporter leaves, you see sort of a return to an escalation of emotion, and sort of how do you manage those kinds of things?
Yeah. Okay. So I think if I understand the first question correctly, I think I think it's asking, um, what is the role of is the role of the supporter to help kind of back up the parent, basically, and say like, your parent is doing this because they love you. This is, what we feel like is best. And so if I understand that correctly, that yes, that can be the role of a supporter. So for example, the kiddo you're working with, they might have a really good relationship with like an aunt or an uncle or an older cousin, or a grandparent, right? Where they feel like safe and confident and comfortable in talking to them. The supporter can be both the support for the parent to back up the parent and say, yeah, we your parent has made this decision. We feel we're in support of that, but also being there for the child, depending on the age, right, or two of the child, but or the teen. But well, we also understand, right, saying those supportive statements. We understand this is hard for you. We understand that we feel like you can work through these difficult feelings. So they're giving those supportive statements. They can be a support for the child as well, but being a kind of an extra support for the parent, because sometimes kids need to hear things. We all know this, right? They need to hear things from multiple sources, to not just think like their parents are out to get them or they're being punished, or hearing it from some other people that they trust can be really helpful in their acceptance of what's going on as well. So I hope I answered that one. Okay. And let us know if I didn't, or you have a follow up for whoever asked that. And then the other question, um, I didn't write that down. Sorry. What was the second part?
The second part was about whether the presence of a supporter might
Oh, I
dampen a
got it.
child's emotional response in
In
the
the moment.
moment, but then there maybe is an escalation once the supporter leaves.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Um, yes. So I'm gonna write down a note because I want to mention this. Okay. So a lot of the time, the initial reaction or response is going to be the highest or the biggest or the worst. Now, it can be dampened, obviously, because with social anxiety, they're pretty good at tampering their emotions, and then, can come out afterwards after somebody leaves. However, the goal or idea of having a supporter there when you're sharing that would be to help get the person who maybe have an anxious response to a place of at least feeling okay, so calming down. So whether that's some regulation activities or doing something that helps them feel better. Maybe they're doing, again, depending on the age, but maybe doing some co-regulation with them, or helping them to just really come out of that emotional mindset. Um, yes, it could be that that person leaves and the child kind of has an emotional reaction again, but typically it's that first reaction that's going to be um, the most emotionally laden if it's new information for them. So the idea would be that supporter would hang out until that has resolved a little bit and they can work through some of those things. There is, if there's concern for the child becoming like aggressive, destructive, like in a physical way, or anything like that, then there's a book that Dr. Ellie recommends, and it's called Nonviolent Resistance by Haim Omer. And it's actually really good as well. And I have used that with families who really need a plan for when their kiddo is going to be responding in an aggressive or kind of violent way.
Excellent. And we are just at 1 o'clock. The last question that I'll throw out there is whether you have or can recommend any resources for schools and teachers? And I guess, is there even a role for space-based interventions at school given the parent focus?
Wow, that sounds like a really cool project. Um, I don't know of one. I think in my work and probably all of our work with kids with SM, we probably find, or I know I do, that parents are the advocates for their kids and the liaison sometimes between what's happening in therapy and what needs to happen for the child, and doing that relaying of messaging. Um, it's interesting. I think with our SM kids, there maybe is more of a role that reducing accommodation could be important, as it relates to. I mean, there would be other, social anxiety. Um, I'm trying to think of some of the other. So space was really created around OCD. And so I think there could be a role for teachers, but again, it's just like when we're trying to teach them about how to interact with our kids with SM in general. It's kind of the same kinds of things. We're trying to teach them tools, and we're trying. It would be interesting to work with teachers in regards to, what accommodations are they doing. But I think in my work with families and reducing, kind of, we can think of it as reducing accommodation, but also like increasing expectation, right, of our SM kids, and like how are they communicating at school, and are we helping to support them with the next level of communication? And I think throughout that process, we are kind of also inadvertently reducing accommodation that's happening in the classroom. Just real quick, the idea that the child maybe is skipped over, right, in like circle time for group, and like, oh well, Johnny doesn't talk, so we're not going to call on him. That's an accommodation to reduce the child's anxiety, right? But if we start working on a plan, how is Johnny going to respond? We don't want him skipped anymore. He's going to respond by showing a picture of his favorite animal or a picture of his favorite color or something like that. We're in and of itself reducing the accommodation by setting a goal and having the teacher kind of follow that. So I feel like it is kind of already happening in our work, but it's a good question.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Goodman, for sharing your expertise with us today. I know that there are a couple questions that we unfortunately didn't get to. For those of you that are SMA members, one of your member benefits is access to our Ask the Expert Q&A feature. So feel free to go onto our website, send your messages into us, and we will follow up. With them as we get them. And once again, the presentation will be available to review on our website. All registrants will get a link to it and also get a link to the slides. So
Thank you
thank
so
you
much for
again,
having me
and
and for everyone being
thanks
here.
everyone for being here.